Luxury watch brands are in trouble. For years, they manipulated the market and forced buyers to pay high prices. And it worked, but now in 2026, 8 of the most famous watch brands in the world are getting a lesson they didn't see coming. And in this video, we'll talk about the disastrous descent of these brands, starting with number 8. Number 8. Longines. There's a specific type of person who buys a Longines. They wanted something real, Swiss-made, elegant, with actual history behind it without going into debt to get it. This was the teacher, the engineer just starting out, the parent buying their kid a graduation gift that would last longer than the diploma. Longines was that watch. A brand with over 180 years of history, genuinely beautiful movements, and prices that said, you don't have to be rich to own something worth owning. Then, 2021 happened. The watch market exploded. And Swatch Group, the conglomerate that owns Longines, looked at what was happening and made a decision. If people are spending, charge more. A Longines Master Collection that cost around $1,400 in 2019 crossed $2,000 by 2022. By 2024, certain references were pushing $2,500. The entry-level pieces, the ones that were the whole point of the brand, quietly disappeared from the lineup or got repositioned upward. Here's the problem nobody at headquarters seemed to think through. Longines doesn't have Rolex's brand ceiling. It doesn't have Omega's cultural mythology. At $2,500, a buyer isn't comparing Longines to Seiko or Tag Heuer. They're comparing it to entry-level Omega. And Omega, for all its problems we'll get to later, still has the moon landing. What does Longines have at that price? A nice watch, with no story to tell at a dinner table. Secondary market values have quietly softened. Authorized dealers in several markets are sitting on inventory they can't move at retail. The brand hasn't collapsed. It's too solid for that, but it has made itself irrelevant to the exact people it was built for. Walk into a Longines boutique today and ask a salesperson why you should buy this instead of a used Omega for the same money. The silence that follows is the answer. There's a father somewhere who bought his daughter a Longines Heritage for her college graduation in 2017. It cost him around $900. He felt good about it. It was a quality gift, meaningful, not embarrassing. She wore it every day for years. Last year, his son graduated. He went back to do the same thing. The watch he remembered was now closer to $2,200. He left and bought something else. That's not a data point. That's a customer Longines lost to itself. Longines priced out its own believers. What came next did something almost worse. It got caught in the shadow of a brand it can never become. Number 7. Tudor. Tudor has always had a complicated identity. It's owned by Rolex, and for decades, that was the pitch. Rolex engineering at a fraction of the price. The Black Bay became one of the most beloved watches of the last 20 years. It made Tudor genuinely cool in a way the brand hadn't been since the 70s. Not just acceptable, actually cool. Watch forums were enthusiastic. Enthusiasts were recommending it without apology. For a stretch, Tudor felt like the smartest buy in Swiss watchmaking. Then, Tudor looked at what people were paying for that cool and decided to extract more of it. The Black Bay 58, that launched at around $3,200 in 2018, now retails close to $4,000. The Pelagos, the diver that was once Tudor's most accessible serious tool watch, has moved into territory where a buyer has to genuinely stop and ask whether they should just stretch a little further for a Rolex Submariner. That is a very dangerous question for Tudor to be inviting. When you raise prices as Tudor, you're not moving toward Rolex. You're closing the gap in a way that only ever benefits Rolex. You're dismantling the one argument that made your brand compelling. I get 90% of the watch for 60% of the price. That argument was the whole reason Tudor existed as a modern brand. Without it, you're just a Rolex with less prestige at almost the same cost. Those 2026 prices means risking buyers doing away. The secondary market confirms it. Tudor watches are trading at 10 to 15% below retail across a number of markets. Not catastrophic, but a signal. The people who bought in during the hype years aren't finding buyers at what they paid. That knowledge spreads through forums, through Reddit threads, through the quiet conversations that happen when enthusiasts compare notes. There's also something subtler happening that doesn't show up in resale data. The watch community has started looking elsewhere. Independent brands, vintage pieces, anything that feels like a genuine discovery rather than a manufacturer instructing you on what to desire. The trap Tudor is caught in is identity-specific. Its entire value proposition was built on punching above its weight. The moment it raises prices to match that perceived weight, it stops punching and starts paying full price. And when you're paying Rolex-adjacent money for a Tudor, the brain does an uncomfortable calculation. I could wait a little longer and just get the real thing. That is not a thought Tudor can afford its buyers to have. Tudor hasn't lost the plot entirely. The watches are still good, but it's standing at a fork in the road, and in 2026, it's walking in the wrong direction. Tudor got greedy in a quiet way. What we're watching next was greedy in a way that wasn't quiet at all, because the people running it were never really in the watch business to begin with. Number 6. Panerai. Panerai used to mean something very specific. Big, Italian, almost brutalist. The watch for people who wanted to be noticed without saying a word. In 2026, it means something quite different. Here's a question that doesn't get asked often enough about Panerai. Who is this watch actually for now? It used to have a clear answer. Panerai was the watch of the Italian Navy, not metaphorically, literally. A tool watch with a face the size of a small dinner plate and a documented history of underwater military operations. When Richemont acquired the brand in the 90s and opened it to the public, collectors lost their minds. Here was authentic horological history beautifully made, aggressively designed, and genuinely rare. The early numbered edition Luminors became some of the most talked about collector pieces of the late 90s and early 2000s. That version of Panerai still technically exists, mostly in the marketing materials. The 2026 version is operating under a different set of pressures. Core Luminor references have pushed past $8,000, up significantly from where they sat not long ago. The brand has expanded its boutique footprint aggressively, which sounds like confidence, but in luxury retail usually signals the opposite. When a watch brand starts opening stores in airports, it's not expanding from a position of strength. It's chasing volume, because the existing customer base isn't growing the way the model needs it to. What's actually happening inside the Richemont structure is harder to discuss because it lives in the financial pages rather than the watch press. Richemont has been rationalizing its portfolio, and Panerai hasn't found a buyer willing to meet Richemont's price expectations. So, the holding strategy appears to be optimize for revenue while maintaining the asset. The collector community noticed. Watch forums that once hosted passionate Panerai fan threads now host autopsy threads. The gray market on Panerais has softened significantly. You can find Luminors at 20 to 30% below retail if you know where to look, which is an extraordinary statement about a brand that spent years carefully cultivating scarcity and community loyalty. The person who bought Panerai as an investment piece in 2022 because they were told the community was strong and the brand was disciplined about supply is now sitting on a loss right now. Not a rumor, an actual loss. Panerai is a brand being managed for someone else's financial exit. The next one made a different bet. They bet on a different kind of buyer entirely, and that buyer moved on. Number 5. Hublot. Some watches are built for time. Hublot was built for a moment. And that moment, roughly 2015 to 2022, was genuinely extraordinary for them. The FIFA World Cup, the Formula One paddock, celebrity collaborations that read like a guest list at the loudest party in the city, Floyd Mayweather wearing the Big Bang before a fight. The watch was everywhere that money was being shown off loudly, and for a specific type of buyer, newly rich, status-hungry, and not particularly interested in the mechanics inside the case, it was exactly right. The Big Bang was a cultural signal, not a horological statement. And for a while, that was enough. Then something shifted. Crypto collapsed. The era of extremely loud, extremely visible wealth display cooled off fast. The buyers who had been wearing Hublots to announce their arrival started looking for something that announced taste instead of money. And taste, it turns out, does not point at Hublot. The watch community, the people who care about movements and finishing and history, had always been lukewarm. Without the hype crowd sustaining it, the brand lost its center of gravity. The secondary market data for Hublot, coming out of 2025 and into 2026, is genuinely brutal. Big Bang references that retailed for $15,000 are trading for $7,000 or less on the open market. A 50% haircut on a recent purchase isn't depreciation, it's a verdict. The market is saying, this watch was always worth half of what you paid, and we're just being honest about it now. LVMH, which owns Hublot, has been quietly trying to reposition the brand toward a slightly older, more serious collector audience. The problem is that this audience looks at Hublot's history, their sourced movements, their pricing relative to what's actually inside the case, and then they buy a Patek Philippe or an IWC, or literally anything with a stronger mechanical story. There's a person who paid $12,000 for a Big Bang in 2021 because a salesperson told him it would hold its value and only go up. He's never going to say that out loud, but he knows. And the people who know tend to make very different decisions the next time around. Hublot bet everything on hype, and hype moved on. What we're watching next made a different gamble, and the numbers just stopped adding up. Number 4. Breitling. Stay with this one for a moment. Because the Breitling story isn't really about watches. It's about how private equity uses legacy brands as financial instruments. And once you see the pattern, you recognize it everywhere. CVC Capital Partners, one of Europe's largest private equity firms, acquired Breitling in 2017. The pitch was textbook. Great heritage brand, underperforming relative to its potential, needs focus and fresh capital. Georges Kern came in as CEO. He made real, visible changes, new designs, sharper marketing. The Navitimer relaunch was genuinely impressive. The Super Ocean got a proper update. On the surface, it looked like a real brand renaissance. The industry press was enthusiastic, but underneath the surface, a different timeline was running. In 2023, CVC brought in new investors at a reported valuation of around $3.2 billion. By 2025, that valuation had been written down by approximately 50% by at least one major institutional holder, a figure that appeared in financial reporting and barely made a ripple in the mainstream watch press, but stopped serious collectors and analysts cold. A 50% valuation write-down is not a bad quarter. It is not a blip. It is a formal statement that the financial story being told about this brand no longer holds. The people who put serious money into it at the higher valuation have effectively been told that number was wrong. Meanwhile, at the brand level, the strategy continued to do exactly what private equity needs brands to do while seeking an exit. Open more boutiques, launch limited editions to justify premium positioning, push retail prices upward to tell a story about where the brand is headed. Every price increase on the tag of a Breitling is not primarily about the watch getting better. It's about maintaining a narrative that keeps the brand saleable at a price CVC finds acceptable. This is the uncomfortable truth that the watch industry doesn't love discussing. When you buy a Breitling in 2026, a meaningful portion of what you're paying for is a pitch deck. You're funding the financial story someone is trying to tell to the next buyer. And that next buyer, in the current climate, has already seen the write-down, which means the asking price and the believed value have come apart. The Navitimer is still a genuine icon. The Super Ocean is still a legitimate tool watch, but they deserve better than being managed as line items in an exit strategy. Breitling is a good watch, trapped inside a financial structure it can't escape. Number 3 was supposed to be completely above all of this. Iconic. Untouchable. And then they started doing the math. Number 3. Omega. Let's be honest about what Omega actually is. Not the corporate entity. The idea. The watch that went to the moon. The Speedmaster Professional. $140 at retail in 1969, strapped to an astronaut's wrist on the surface of another world. That's not a marketing copy. That's documented history. The kind of story you genuinely cannot manufacture with a budget, no matter how large. For most of the 20th century, Omega understood what it had and what it was for. an icon that was accessible enough to be genuinely aspirational rather than untouchably elite. The person who saved up for a Speedmaster wasn't just buying a watch. They were buying a connection to something that actually happened, the greatest single achievement in human exploration. That's a powerful thing to carry on your wrist. That story was the product as much as the movement inside the case. In 2024, the Speedmaster Moonwatch Professional crossed $8,000 at authorized dealers in major markets. $8,000. For context, the year before Apollo 11, a Speedmaster cost roughly what an average American worker earned in a week. Today, that same watch costs what many workers earn in a month and a half. And it hasn't been to the moon lately. The Swatch Group pricing strategy under its leadership was, for years, to use Omega as the premium anchor of the group's prestige story. That made sense when prices were calibrated to the audience. But the pace of increases since 2020. Omega's retail prices rose by somewhere between 30 and 40% across the catalog in under 4 years. Broke something fundamental in the brand's relationship with the people who had always been its most loyal customers. These weren't the ultra-wealthy collector crowd. These were the middle-income enthusiasts, the watch community lifers, the people who told their friends and recommended Omega without being asked. That audience has been priced out of the entry point, and they've noticed. They've also noticed that the brand's response to declining volumes, at least based on the communication coming out of Swatch Group, appears to be stay the course. The March 2nd leak that the collector community has been quietly circulating suggests no reversal is coming. They're holding the line. Meanwhile, Swatch Group's overall revenue has faced headwinds that multiple consecutive quarterly reports have confirmed. Omega's contribution to that picture hasn't been separated out publicly, but the trend is visible. There's a collector who bought his Speedmaster in 1998 for under $2,000. He tells people it was worth every penny. He's right. It absolutely was. But when his son asks about buying one today, the math has changed so completely that the story doesn't work the same way anymore. The moon is still there, but the watch that was supposed to connect ordinary people to it has quietly moved out of their reach. That's the real cost, not the earnings report, the story. Omega is losing the plot on the most powerful story in watchmaking. Number 2 has a different kind of story, one built not on history, but on manufactured scarcity. And it may be the most deliberately calculated game on this list. Number 2, Cartier. Cartier is arguably the most elegant brand on this list, and it ran arguably the least elegant strategy. Let's start with what happened in Cartier boutiques around 2022 and 2023. If you walked in looking for a Santos, and it was your first visit, you were told it wasn't available. Wait times quoted at months. Sometimes considerably longer. At certain boutiques, purchasing history with the brand was required before you could access particular references. You needed to have spent money on jewelry, on other pieces, to earn the right to spend money on the watch you actually came in for. The waiting list narrative was deployed broadly and convincingly. Here's the question nobody was asking loudly enough at the time. Where were the watches? Because simultaneously, certified pre-owned Cartier pieces were appearing through Richemont's own watchfinder platform and through authorized secondary channels at premiums of $3,000 to $5,000 above the new retail price. For watches that supposedly didn't exist in sufficient supply to sell to the customer standing at the counter. The gray market worked it out before the press did. Some inventory was not going directly to retail customers through the front door. It was being routed through channels that generated premium revenue outside the official retail structure, while the artificial scarcity story was maintained at the boutique level. This isn't speculation dressed up as analysis. The secondary market mechanics around Cartier's steel sports pieces during this window were documented extensively by watch market analysts and independent collectors who tracked the data with considerable rigor. Think about what that meant for the actual buyer. Someone who saved for 2 years for a tank Americaine. Not as an investment, not as a status piece, because they genuinely loved the design and wanted something that would last decades. They registered. They waited. They called back. They were told again, not available. Meanwhile, that same reference was sitting on Watchfinder at a $4,000 premium above the price they'd been told to wait for. They figured it out, and they are not coming back. In 2026, Richemont has made public commitments to authorized dealer reform and has pushed back on gray market activity in its communications. The structural changes are real, but the damage to collector trust is not repaired by a policy change. High net worth buyers who understood what was being done to them are not forgetting. They are moving toward independent brands, toward Nomos, toward Oris, toward F, P, Journe for those with the budget. Anywhere the transaction feels honest. The love for Cartier's design language isn't dead. The trust is cracked. Those are very different problems, and only one of them responds to a new collection. Cartier ran a calculated game, got caught, and is now managing the fallout. Number 1 never needed games. Number 1 was supposed to be the brand that was completely above all of this, and that's exactly what makes what they did so extraordinary. Number 1, Rolex. This is the one you're going to want to argue with. Good. That means you understand exactly what it means. Rolex is not failing. Let's be absolutely clear. Rolex remains the most powerful watch brand on the planet, by almost any measure you want to apply. The quality is real, the heritage is real, the demand from serious buyers remains real. Nothing in this segment should be read as a prediction that Rolex is in trouble in any conventional sense. What this segment is about is something more specific, something harder to quantify and harder to fix. They may have broken something that can't be quietly repaired. It starts with the dealer relationship, specifically what happened to it between 2020 and 2024. During the watch boom, Rolex's authorized dealer network became a vehicle for extraordinary and well-documented abuse. Dealers discovered that allocations of desirable references, like the Submariner, the Daytona, and the GMT Master II, were worth dramatically more on the gray market than at retail. So they built systems, purchase history requirements, the practice of bundling a desirable Rolex allocation with mandatory purchases of slower-moving inventory from other brands. Client data being shared with gray market intermediaries in documented cases. Customers with 10 and 15 years of relationship history being told there was simply nothing available. Rolex's public position was clear. Gray market activity was discouraged. The brand issued statements. But for years, it did not take the structural action required to stop its own dealer network from profiting from it. The structures that enabled the abuse were left in place. That silence was a choice. And the people who were paying the price for it noticed. The 2024 and 2025 gray market correction delivered the second half of the story. Daytona premiums normalized sharply. GMT Master II prices on the secondary market pulled back toward and in some cases below retail prices. The bubble that the dealer network had been managing popped in the way bubbles eventually do. And when it popped, buyers who had paid $20,000 for a watch retailing at $12,500 found themselves holding something worth $11,000 on the open market. Not everyone. Not everywhere. But enough people, in enough cities, for it to become the loudest conversation in watchmaking. Here's the deeper wound, and this is what no one in Rolex's communication operation wants to confront directly: the investment watch narrative, which Rolex did not create but absolutely benefited from and never once formally corrected, is now a liability. The watch that was supposed to only go up went down. For some buyers, significantly down. There are people who financed a Rolex purchase on a payment plan in 2022 because they genuinely believed the investment story. They had watched friends and strangers make money flipping gray market watches. The mythology made it feel rational. They are currently paying monthly interest on a watch worth less than what they owe on it. Rolex did not tell them to do that. But the story Rolex allowed to flourish around its brand made it feel like a reasonable bet. That mythology is damaged now. Not destroyed, damaged. And here is the most important thing. Rolex is number 1 on this list not because it's in the deepest trouble. It isn't. Not even close. It's number 1 because the distance between what this brand represents and what the actual experience of acquiring one has become is the largest gap in all of watchmaking. Rolex sells the idea of calm, quiet, generational excellence. A watch your grandfather wore that your son will want. steady, trustworthy, above the fray. The process of buying one in 2022 and 2023, the favors you needed, the bundled purchases, the relationship building, the wait, the gray market premium if you wanted to skip the game, was the precise opposite of every word in that brand promise. The watch and the experience of obtaining it became strangers to each other. Buyers who finally got to the counter after years of waiting were more likely to feel relieved than transformed. Relief is not what Rolex is supposed to feel like. That's not the emotion the brand was built to deliver. There was a version of this brand where someone saved up for 5 years, walked into a dealer, bought a Datejust, and walked out feeling like they had earned something that meant something. That experience still exists for some people, but it has become inconsistent, and the gap between the mythology and the reality is wide enough now that people are talking about it openly. The crown hasn't fallen, but it has slipped, and somewhere in Geneva, in a room full of very smart people who think about brand equity for a living, someone knows exactly how much work it is going to take to close that gap. Here's what every brand on this list has in common. None of them made stupid decisions. That's the unsettling part. Every price increase had a rationale. Every boutique expansion had a business case behind it. Every scarcity strategy had a financial model. The people making these decisions were not incompetent. In most cases, they were the opposite. The problem wasn't stupidity. The problem was that they optimized for the boom and forgot to build for what comes after. What comes after is this: buyers get smarter. Gray market prices are transparent and real-time. Watch forums do more rigorous financial journalism than most of the mainstream outlets covering the industry, and the collector starts to feel like a mark instead of a customer. Once a buyer feels like a mark, you can't undo that. There's a person who spent 2023 bouncing between boutiques trying to buy their first serious watch, getting bundled, getting waitlisted, getting told what they needed to purchase first before they could access what they actually came in for. They ended up with an Oris Aquis, a brand nobody in those boutiques would have recommended, at a price that felt fair. From a dealer who treated them like a human being. They wear it every day. They've never once looked at resale platforms to see what it's worth. That buyer existed 20 years ago too. The difference is that in 2026, they have real options. And the industry that used to be able to count on their eventual surrender has lost them permanently. Some of the brands on this list will course correct. A few are already quietly doing it. Others are locked inside ownership structures that don't allow for course correction. Private equity doesn't reverse course. It exists. And whoever buys the brand next inherits whatever trust deficit comes with it. The watch market in 2026 is not dying. It's sorting. The brands that remembered who they were built for are doing fine. The ones that mistook a once-in-a-generation bubble for a permanent new reality are paying for that confusion right now. The question worth sitting with, whether you wear a watch, want to buy one, or have one sitting in a safe somewhere. Who did you trust with your money and your belief? And did they deserve it? If you made it this far, you care about this stuff more than the average person. Drop your pick in the comments. What brand do you think is doing it right in 2026? Like this video and subscribe.